This meeting was planned 2 weeks ago, nearly 2 weeks ago, on the day that 18 unarmed Palestinians were gunned down in cold blood. Everyone, I think, would have seen the pictures on the Gaza-Israel border. Since then, and further 11 Palestinians have been killed under similar circumstances, including a young photographer, Yasser Mortaja. And not only that, there's been increased retribution against the Palestinians, not only in Gaza, where fresh water has been cut off since Wednesday of last week, already in a situation for 1.5 million people in besieged Gaza, of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, but also further incursions into the West Bank under full occupation, and of course no remorse at all, in fact the opposite, from the Israeli state. Avigdor Lieberman, the defense minister, threatening all-out war against the Palestinians in Gaza and possibly even in the West Bank. That's not the only thing that's happened. On Saturday, there was the suspected chemical, I say suspected because that is the international language which ought to be used, suspected chemical weapons attack in eastern Ghouta, the small area of Duma. About now, the inspectors of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons are to land in Damascus and begin their work on Saturday. Despite that, Israel bombed the Homs air base on Monday, killing 14 people, and bombed it with planes flying over Lebanese airspace. So Israeli planes fly over Lebanese airspace and bomb, killing 14 people in Syria. Clearly, one element of that is to deflect from their own war crimes, but it shows an intimate connection between the question of Palestine and the question of war and imperialism in the Middle East. And it's not just a geographical question, that Palestine, the historic area of Palestine, is next to both Lebanon and Syria. And it's not just a contemporary connection, that you see attacks on the Palestinians, be it in Gaza or the West Bank, at the same time as you see an escalation of wars all over the Middle East and indeed in North Africa. It's a deep connection and an historic connection, because in a sense, if we talk about Israel, Palestine, we need to talk about London, Washington and Paris. It's a story of not Jews and Arabs, it's a story of the West and the Middle East. It's a story of capitalism and it's a story of imperialism. And I just want to say a little bit about that. I mean, I'm sure many people will be familiar with it, but just to refresh our minds a little before moving on to the how question. How can we contribute here to transforming the situation and to the liberation of Palestine? One intimate connection is, of course, if imperialism, great powers stomping around the world, carving up the globe, is one ugly child of capitalism, another ugly child of capitalism is racism. And the Zionist movement, the movement for the creation of an Israeli, of a Jewish state, was a response, a particular kind of response, a minority response, to the very real question of anti-Jewish racism, anti-Semitism at the latter part of the 19th century. A modern form of racism, not the old religious tensions and worse that you had in the Middle Ages. And modern and quite shocking, because people thought we had these new, modern, liberal capitalist societies like France and Britain at the time, the United States possibly after they got rid of slavery in 1865, and these old medieval superstitions will go away. In fact, they came back with a vengeance. I just want to emphasise this point, given arguments that have been taking place, or I should say smear campaigns that have been taking place against the left in this country. This was generated on the right, against the left, for two reasons. One, it was to distract people, to divide and rule, a growing working class, of which in countries such as Poland, Germany, France, there was a considerable Jewish working class. So to set one group of people against another, which is the way that all racism works. The second was to provide a kind of false explanation for the crimes of capitalism. Capitalism, it's not capitalism to blame, it's Jewish capitalism to blame. And this was done on the right in competition with the left. That's the anti-Semitism. The Zionist movement said, well, look, this shows that the anti-Semitism can't be fought. Their conclusion was not to move in an anti-capitalist direction. And so they ended up also competing with the left. And it's very important to understand that until really the disaster of the Holocaust and the years immediately after the Second World War, the idea of upping and offing from Europe and founding a Jewish state somewhere was a minority, a very small minority current amongst the Jews of Europe, which is where the majority lived. Biggest concentration was in Poland. I'll give you this quote from as late as 1938 from a man called Heinrich Ehrlich, who was a leader of what was called the Bund, the Jewish Socialist Workers' Movement. Most of the Jewish urban dwellers looked to the left in one form or another. And this is in 1938. He says, if a Jewish state should arise in Palestine, its spiritual climate will be eternal fear at the enemy without, and an eternal struggle for every foot of ground, for every bit of work with the internal enemy, Palestinians who are already living in the place called Palestine. Is this a climate in which freedom, democracy and progress can grow? Is it not, indeed, a climate in which reaction and chauvinism ordinarily flourish? And that's 80 years ago, and this is the most prescient description of what's happened to the state of Israel through its exclusion of the Palestinians. Now, one reason why the state is so reactionary and why it continues to become more and more reactionary, you have these hideous creatures like Netanyahu and Lieberman, is that it was intimately connected with imperialism, not just that it was a reaction against European racism in a distorted way, but the only way that a state could be founded in Palestine where Palestinians were living was with the support of an external, big, colonizing European power. And that power came to be Britain at the end of towards the end of the First World War. By 1916, Britain and France at its side were already beginning to win making plans for winning the First World War, at least in the Middle East, where the Turkish old empire was falling apart, the empire which ran the Arab lands, and already beginning to divide up in secret treaties, parcel out the land, creating a place called Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and deciding which kings would sit upon these thrones, which hadn't previously existed. So Britain has the sphere of influence in Palestine and comes to an arrangement in 1917 with the Zionist movement to support the creation of an exclusively Jewish state in an area which Britain didn't even yet control, certainly not which it had the right to control. This was the historic area of Palestine. And the logic of it was summed up by a man called Sir Ronald Storrs, who became, in his words, in 1921, the first military governor of Palestine since Pontius Pilate, 2,000 years ago. So he was quite a modest man, as you can imagine. He said, the aim of this operation, certainly not pro-Jewish or against anti-Semitism, was, in his words, to create a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. He knew what he was talking about because in 1921 Britain had overseen the partition of Ireland. Rather than give the Irish independence, it divided it into north and south with a legacy that continues to today, with the Troubles, with the, despite the so-called peace process, the failure, all the things that you see in the news. So this is what they transferred to Palestine. You have an increase in Jewish immigration into Palestine, organised by the Zionist movement, dwarfed by the number of people going to the United States or going to the East End of London and so on. Now, the British oversaw Palestine, had the mandate through until 1948. Now, you often hear talk of a two-state solution. You know, there are two groups of people. living on this land. Let's have two states, one for Jews who immigrated into there, one for the Palestinians. There was a two-state solution. This was the plan for the British to try to reconcile creating this exclusively Jewish state which wouldn't let Arabs be even part of the economy. It was progressively pushing them off the land, and the Palestinians who were pushed into an ever smaller part of Palestine. There was a partition plan in 1947, agreed to in 1948 by the United Nations. On the day that the partition plan was supposed to come into operation, there was a massive military expansion by the nascent Israeli state, which expelled 750,000 Palestinians and grabbed almost all of the remaining land, leaving just two parts. The reason for this is there's an inbuilt dynamic, expansionist dynamic to the Zionist project, for the reason that this Jewish socialist in 1938 pointed out, that you will always have an internal enemy, these Palestinians who don't accept being second-class citizens. And if you displace the Palestinians, you have an external enemy of people who don't accept that the house that their grandfather was born in is now being occupied by a settler. And the only way out of that is to constantly expand and push people further and further away. And this has been the whole process of the Israeli state since then. Now, the connection with imperialism didn't just go away when the British Empire folded in the 40s and 50s as a kind of formal empire. The new sponsor, particularly after 1967, when Israel won a war against its neighbours and expanded into the West Bank and Gaza, so occupying all of historic Palestine. The connection with imperialism, the sponsor became with the United States, with Britain as a junior partner. Now, that wasn't the only state that the United States supported and had, if not as a client state, certainly an ally in the Middle East. And it's not the only one now, if you look at the Saudi state and so on. There's something special about the Israeli state, and it continues to be so, which is because it's based upon this apartheid system of those Palestinians living within the borders of Israel proper, as it were. It means that the Jewish Israelis, even the Jewish working class, who are exploited by Israeli capitalists, constantly feel the sense of national identity over class identity. Constantly feel that. There's some pressures away from that, but constantly feel that. And what that means is, in this whole volatile region, the centre of which, of course, has been control of oil supplies in the Persian Gulf, Israel's the state which, despite huge volatility and revolutions taking place throughout the region in the course of the last 80 years, Israel's been internally stable because it's this settler state. It's a bit like South Africa was. The difference with South Africa is that while the black people who were the victims of apartheid in South Africa were drawn into the economy, into the mines, into the fields and so on, and therefore had some kind of collective power which ultimately broke the back of apartheid, the method of Israeli apartheid is to separate the Palestinian people from the land and also from the Israeli economy. So therefore there isn't the same class basis, power potentially inside of the, which I'm going to return to in a few moments. There isn't the same class basis for Palestinian power inside of the state. Nevertheless, it's critical to understand we can only talk about Palestine now and how Palestine can be free because for 80 years, 70 years, the Palestinians have not dropped the struggle for either a state of their own at points or for a single state in which people could live together and share the resources on a democratic and preferably socialist basis. And this is a remarkable achievement. If you talk about the deluge of oppression and massacres that have been meted out against the Palestinian people. One of the early Israeli leaders said, the first generation of Palestinians will die out, the second generation will forget. Well, we're now on to the fourth and in some cases fifth generations, and nobody has forgotten. You can ask a Palestinian anywhere in the world where are you from? And if they're in Brooklyn, they'll say, I'm from Brooklyn, but my family's from Haifa. And they can possibly name the street that their grandparents were driven out of. So without the Palestinian resistance, there would be no talk of Palestine. And also without the Palestinian resistance, it's possible that some kind of Bantustan settlement might have been created before. The kind of settlement that was tried in South Africa, you know, would put the blacks on reservations, or what happened to the original inhabitants of North America, of the United States and Canada. The second thing about the resistance is that it has consistently frustrated the wider ambitions of the United States imperialism and its allies in the region, because while Israel has been internally stable amongst the Jewish population, that's not true of other US allies over the course of the last 60 or 70 years. You know, in the 1950s, 1950, Egypt, Iraq and Jordan were all absolutely solid British or American allies. By the end of the 1950s, there had been revolutions in Egypt and in Iraq. Not the greatest of revolutions bringing a kind of socialist transformation or even the most democratic form, but ones which had broken those states away, at least temporarily, from being completely subservient to British and then to US imperialism. More recently, we've seen the Arab Spring, so-called, of 2011, and notwithstanding the fact that the counter-revolutionary wave is still not quite at high tide, but is still dominating inside Egypt and in other countries, the underlying reasons for those revolts continue all the way from Morocco through to Bahrain, which is why, you know, General Sisi proclaims the level of support that he got in the election, and any Egyptian you speak to laughs. They say the number that counts is not the vote that he got in the election, but the price of tomatoes. Because, you know, what is because the consequence of the imperialist domination has been not just external exploitation of the region, but the creation of the most grotesque class inequalities, which is seen probably most obviously in the Gulf states, somewhere like Saudi Arabia, where they're now very worried that the Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, who's trying to broaden the base of support for the regime, that this slight process of opening up might lead to eruptions inside of Saudi Arabia. And so there's been constant attempts to try to modify the Middle East to keep it under control, of which the biggest was, 15 years ago, the idea to use Tony Blair's flippant phrase, given the millions who've died since, the kaleidoscope has been shaken. Let's see where the pieces land. And they thought that by invading Iraq, they could drive through a pro-Western modernization throughout the whole region. In fact, it's been a disaster. And what they had before, they no longer have now. What they had before was at least some ordering of these different states with the US and its allies, NATO and so on at the top, and then a pecking order which generally held things together. Turkey, Egypt under Mubarak, Israel critically because of this particular quality it has, Saudi Arabia. Now, 15 years on from the Iraq War, everything is much more in flux. Different states clashing with each other, seen most horribly inside of Syria, the big powers and the local powers clashing with one another. Okay, so where does that leave us with the last few minutes in terms of how can Palestine be free? Well, the whole history of any advance that the Palestinians have made has been connected with wider social struggle in the Middle East, and the resistance of the Palestinians has fed into the struggles for democracy or against imperialism or for social justice in countries like Egypt. This is most obvious in Egypt, where if you want to see the origins of the process of 2011, where people rose up and overthrew Mubarak, It starts in 2001 with an intifada, a struggle by the Palestinians against a particular offensive by the Israeli government. That leads to a solidarity protest in Egypt, breaking the ban on demonstrations for the first time. So 2011 in Egypt, the siege started in 2001 as a consequence of the Palestinian struggle. And it feeds back that there was great hope, of course, from the Egyptian revolution. So one key aspect is the wider struggles inside the Middle East, which brings us to the second. Despite all the firepower of Israel, it's very important, and despite the immense bias of the British media and political establishment, it's very important to understand that the political capital of Israel is lower now in the world than at any time since the foundation of the Zionist entity in 1948. I mean, there are people in the room who will know that if you spoke about Israel-Palestine back in 1982, this would be the big rally that we'd have in London, not the discussion meeting. BBC found that 66% of people in Britain have a negative view of Israel. This is absolutely historic. I mean, you saw last weekend the demonstration, a couple of thousand, an emergency demonstration. The pro-Israel demonstration and anti-left demonstration had a tenth of that the following day, and highly right-wing. You know, if you won't wave Union Jacks and so on, it's a Tory demonstration. The reason why they attack Labour over this is because the Labour movement, into participation in Palestine solidarity and the anti-war movement, has become increasingly seeded by a pro-Palestinian struggle. That's the second element. The third element is the growing movement, one aspect of which, tactic of which is the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which people will know about. It just continues to register successes. So Dublin, a capital of a European country, has now voted for the boycott, divestment and sanctions decision, and implemented it by cancelling a contract with Hewlett-Packard, I think. What does the Israeli state do in response? The Lord Mayor of Dublin, you know how everybody likes the Irish around the world, right? The Lord Mayor of Dublin turns up to Ben Gurion Airport and they try to stop him from coming into the country. I mean, it's a PR disaster. And this is important to remember because often we get bombarded with, you get the echo chamber of the media tells you that people are strongly pro-Israel, when in fact there's a rise in pro-Palestinian sentiment. Directly through the work of Palestine solidarity, but also through the vital movements against war and imperialism that have been developed over the last 15 years. And I think that the next few weeks we're going to see how intertwined those things are with the growing crisis over Syria, the possibility of a really very, very serious war, and certainly a bombing taking place quite possibly this weekend, entwined with the Palestinian question. The last thing I want to say is this about how the support for Palestine, the combination of the struggle within, the struggle in the Middle East, and the international solidarity movement. The last thing I want to say is about how that strengthens all of us in all of our work, because Palestine has become the kind of compass point, the lodestone of international progressive struggle. What I mean by that is if you look at people protesting in South Africa against economic apartheid, you'll find the Palestinian flag. If you find people on Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the United States, you find the Palestinian flag. Anti-racist demonstrations here. It's almost as if you see a movement from afar and you say, is it moving in a progressive direction? Well, is there a Palestinian flag? If it is, it's moving in a radical direction. And that's certainly the case in the Middle East, where you can have all sorts of attempts to subvert movements. So there's a protest essentially about economic conditions in Iran. A good test about where those movements is going is to say to those people, they're very mixed in terms of the demands. Some people were saying, the government's doing far too, talking all about Gaza, supporting the Palestinians, we need to put Iran first and forget the Arabs. You can be very clear what general direction that movement will go in. Other people were saying the government talks about Palestine but doesn't do enough for Palestine. You've also got a good idea where that movement is going. So I just want to end by saying this is a long struggle. The reason why it seems so intractable is because it brings the Palestinian people and the people of the Middle East more generally directly up against the legacy of imperialism and the current forces of imperialism. And it's a part of that struggle, and it's an historic responsibility in a country like Britain, developing the movements directly around Palestine, directly against the wars and imperialism, but also bringing home the internationalism and the sense of resistance throughout all of the class struggles in Britain is really critical. And that's a contribution that I think we can make. And it's because that contribution has been cumulatively made over the last 15 years that you see the right wing in this country going wild and why the left must not give an inch.